Our scripture reading this morning comes from Job 1, verse 1, chapter 1, and verse 2, chapters 1 through, 1 through 10. Okay. There was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and turned away from evil. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Skin for skin, all that people have they will give to save their lives. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, he is in your power, only spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job from the soles of his foot to the crown of his head. Job took a potsherd with which to scrape himself and sat among the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die?" But he said to her, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" In all this Job did not sin with his lips. This is the word of the Lord.
So today we get 11 verses from the book of Job, but really over the next 15 minutes or so you're going to get the whole book of Job. All 40 some odd chapters. Because the book of Job is just easy to consolidate within 15 minutes, is it not? It's been called by Kathleen O'Connor, who is an Old Testament professor, the puzzle that cannot be solved. The puzzle that cannot be solved. Because let's face it, the book of Job makes no sense. It makes absolutely zero sense. You have this man by the name of Job, blameless and upright. He respected God. He feared God. He turned away from all that was evil. He was so faithful. He was so blameless. He was so upright that on those Friday and Saturday nights when his children were off eating and drinking and engaging in all kinds of revelry, Job would get up the next day and offer sacrifices on his children's behalf, just in case at some point during the night they sinned against God in their hearts. He offered sacrifices just in case his children did something wrong. That's how faithful Job was. The book of Job is a folktale of sorts for us all. Which isn't to say that there was not a man named Job from the land of Uz who endured great suffering. No, I mean it's a folktale simply because it is a story whose legend stands on its own, transcending all cultures, all circumstances, time and place. Like any good story, like any good folktale, the book of Job focuses more on events and morals of the story rather than, if you will, spending a whole bunch of extra time in character development. But make no mistake, the book of Job does contain an interesting cast of characters. Of course, you have the man himself, Job, blameless and upright, respected God, turning away from evil. You have God, Yahweh, in the heavenly court, in the heavenly council. You have the heavenly adversary. The heavenly adversary, Ha-Satan, it is in the Hebrew. Ha-Satan, from which we get Satan. Ha-Satan, a member of God's heavenly court, whose original role was to seek out and accuse people who were disloyal to God. Once the adversary of corrupt and sinful humans, Ha-Satan now becomes the adversary of God. God, he says, let's have some fun. Let's roll the dice. Let's place a bet. Anyone can bless you and praise you when all in the world and all in life is going well. It's not that hard to praise you and worship you. But God, let things go wrong. Let things go south real quickly. And let's see how your faithful servant Job handles that. I don't know why God agreed to the bet. I wish I did. Does God have some kind of ego that we're not aware of? Does God want to prove God's self so right that God is willing to offer up perhaps the most righteous person ever to walk the face of the earth to that time? If so, what does that say about God? What does that say about a God who supposedly loves human beings so much that God is willing to risk a human being just to prove a point? Of course, you have Job's friends. Now, they're not mentioned in the verses that Deb read, but Job's friends play an important role in the book of Job. They might as well have been called Larry, Moe, and Curly, rather than Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Their theology, their understanding of God, their reliance upon compassionless cliches in the midst of trouble, in the midst of grief, in the midst of pain, make them the kind of friends we all have, and the kind of friends you never want to see or talk to when times get hard. Dr. Hannah Carter, Florence Carter, who is a professor of homiletics at Columbia School of Theology in Atlanta, she was teaching the book of Job in a preaching class, and so she had all of her students go through those middle chapters of Job and to pull out all of those cliches, all of the sayings that Job's friends bring to the table in their conversations with Job. And so they did the task fully and faithfully. Here are some of the things you hear Job's friends say to him. Let me know if any of these sound familiar. Job, what happened to you? It was the will of God. Job, sometimes God lets bad things happen to us to test us. Be comforted, Job, your children who just died, well, they're in a better place now. Job, God needed more angels in heaven. Job, here's a Bible verse I once read. Read this and maybe you'll feel better. Job, you know what? I was depressed once, so I prayed and then I felt better. Have you tried praying? You're a strong person, Job. God only lets this happen because you're strong enough to handle it. Well, Job, at least look on the bright side. You can now fit into your smaller clothes because of all the weight you have lost from not eating. Job, if you'd had just a little bit more faith, I don't think any of this would have happened to you. Job, what happened to you happened at a really, really bad time for me. It really would have been better for me if all of this would have happened next week. Now, folks, that's Bible. That's what you find in the middle of the book of Job. in the dialogue and in the conversations between Job and Job's friends. Those sayings we've all heard in some shape, form, or fashion at some point in our life. Somebody has said those to us. Maybe we've even dared say those to somebody else. I hope not, but it's possible. These sayings, I believe, reflect one of the greatest issues that we find in the book of Job, and that is this: we don't know what to do. We don't know really what to do with the book of Job. We really don't know how to explain or understand or live into the pain and suffering that either we experience or that our loved ones experience. And so when we don't know what to do, we cling to anything we possibly can. And I've heard people say some of these very same things, and they said, well, there it is, it's in the Bible, so that must be exactly what it means and exactly how God feels. No. Context is important. And understanding the difference between how God feels and how we try to explain things in the midst of pain and suffering. But the questions that are brought about by the pain and suffering that we experience and that our friends experience, they're very real. They're very real. And the number one question most often brought about by the book of Job is, why do bad things happen to good people? But perhaps there's another question that we need to explore. Question is, why are we good to begin with? Why do we practice what is good, what is just, what is fair, what is loving? What is our motivation for being good? We hear Job's motivation. He was blameless, he was faithful, he respected God. There was no one else like him. But yet, even Satan, even Job's wife, questioned his motivations before God. Satan said, you know what, God? I bet he only praises you. I bet he's only good because of all the things that have happened to him. Why are people good to begin with? What motivates our goodness? Are we good and just for the sake of being good and just? Or are we good and just because we think there is some reward for us? Some reward for good behavior? Perhaps being good for goodness' sake is the way to be. Perhaps being righteous for righteousness' sake is the way to be. My Old Testament professor in seminary, Carol Newsom, said about the book of Job that there are no simple answers. There are no simple answers as to why God's people suffer. There are no simple answers to why good people must endure bad and horrible things. And yet, perhaps part of our problem is that we are too often looking for the simple answers in life, rather than taking the time to wrestle with and struggle with the depth and the breadth of reality. The depth and the breadth that life gives to us. And so Dr. Newsom says that for the reader willing to forego those simplistic answers, the book of Job offers a challenging exploration of religious importance. A challenging exploration of religious importance. Exploring the motivation for our piety, the motivation for our goodness, the meaning of suffering in the world, the nature of God, the place for justice in the world, the relationship of order and chaos in God's design for creation, it is a puzzle. It is a puzzle that cannot be solved because not all of the pieces fit tightly and snugly and beautifully together and easily. It is like a puzzle that has no end pieces to hold everything else that's in the middle together and give it a sense of order. I've always been told when I put together a puzzle, whether it's the 10-piece puzzle that I prefer or the 400-piece puzzle that Courtney prefers, you always start with the outside pieces, the end pieces. It gives you structure. It gives you order. The book of Job has no outside or end pieces to hold things together, which is appropriate because sometimes life is chaotic. And sometimes it feels as if life is not being held together very well. The house is a mess. The kids will not listen. The dog is barking. The TV is too loud. The doorbell is ringing. You're ready to scream. It's chaos. It's bedlam. But every week you go to church. Every week, there you are praying and singing and worshiping. You treat one another with respect. You don't cut anyone off in traffic. You don't lie or cheat on your taxes. And then you get up and you go to work on Monday and the boss tells you that the company has now been bought out and your job is no longer necessary. You clean out your desk and you go home and face the messy house and the barking dog and the kids that don't listen. And because now you have time in your schedule, you decide to go on to that doctor's appointment on Wednesday where she tells you that they have found now a shadow on an x-ray, even though you have never smoked a day in your life. It becomes one thing right after another. No break, no sign to the end of the misery. And so you wonder, what is the point in even trying? Why do I even bother? Why bother being that good person if all that is going to happen to me is the bad, bad stuff? Not helping matters. You got 3 neighbors who decide they want to come over and sit on your porch with you. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They just want to come over and sit on your front porch and eat all of your food and drink all of your beer and give you the worst advice that's ever been recorded in the history of advice that's ever been given. And when it's all said and done, after some 42 chapters of speeches and blaming and lament and arguing, the main question the book of Job calls us to ponder is this: what is your faith really made of? What is your faith really made of? Is your faith something that can be bought or sold or gambled with or changes depending on which way the wind blows? In the end of the story, it's just God and Job. No more questions, no more answers. And in the final chapter, Job responds to God's presence by saying, I have uttered what I did not understand. Things that are too wonderful for me, which I did not know. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now with my eyes I see you. I see you now. Job, in the end, finally sees God. And we see that Job, through the depth of his suffering, still maintains the goodness and the love and the faithfulness of the one who created him. What is your faith really made of? When you engage in ministry to and for others, Is it really about the needs of others? Is it really about living into and being faithful to the greatest commandment, to love God, to love neighbor? Or is it some kind of added notch in your belt? When you go to church and worship, is it done so as an act of love for God? Or is it just to make sure that your ledger in the end ends up in the black? Is anything you do really about reflecting God's love in the world? Or is it about you and what you get out of it? What is your faith really made of? So what do you do with all of this? What do you do with the story of a man who is good and just and has all of these awful things happen to him, one right after another? I'm not sure what you do. I'm not sure what you do. But I am pretty sure that the answer of how you treat the faith of Job will say something about how you treat the faith you possess. It'll say something about how you will treat the faith that others possess. And it will say something about how you treat the faith